organization of the Roman Republic, at least until the late 2nd century BC, offered one of the ideal models to the founding fathers to justify and defend, and this is what we're going to talk about today, their choice of government for the newly born federal republics of the United States of America. So that the Roman Republic has been studied and adapted by the founding fathers in the process of establishing the American Constitution is not new material. So in the allegedly at least representation of all strata of the society, the institution, in the institutions and in the collegiality and temporality of the magistracies, the founders of the United States saw the ideal precedent model to their new state. And this new state, in addition to cut the ties with the English monarchy, still considered by some of them one of the most righteous form of government, would have a written constitution, an elected assembly, a Supreme Court in charge of interpreting the constitution, and a single president to enforce the decisions of the courts, whose figure was at least partially inspired on a on a controlled, let's say, form of a Roman dictator. So differently than Rome, the constitution in the United States will also include a judiciary power separate from the others. A Bill of Rights, which I will return later, was soon included to protect individual liberties of citizens after the anti-federalists showed some perplexities on the original form of the constitution. Active citizenry, but not an all people power, as we know, women and enslaved people were excluded, had been from its foundation essential to the government of the US. So references to Rome start to appear almost immediately in support of the new political order. In the Federalist Papers, for example, and there is an example in Endnote 1, Alexander Hamilton, while addressing the issue of the legislative authority in the Constitution, refers to the Roman Comitia as the preferred precedent for balanced representation of both patricians and plebeians. He also ends the paragraph by saying that thanks to the use of double legislatures, the Comitia Centuriata and Tributa, the Roman Republic attained the utmost height of human greatness. In other words, by using the Roman precedent as a model for the new establishment, the founders of the United States made it clear that they considered the Roman Republic a form of ancient democracy, which had achieved a balanced representation of the different strata of the society and was able to keep things under control, at least for a certain amount of time. Balance, as we shall briefly see, is a key word when discussing the weight of the Roman precedent to the newly established United States. So I would not be surprised if people here would be hesitant in defining Rome the perfect example of a democracy, especially after we discussed, the Athens, of course, Athens democracy and the, Hellenistic attempts to keep democracy alive. If only, for the clearly privileged power given to the richest that it endured. It can be argued the same for the United States at their beginning. As I said, only men, and specifically only men with taxable property, could aim at being represented in the assemblies. And this will remain true for many decades ahead. And again, one may also ask why Rome and not Athens as the ideal constitutional model. John Adams, the second president of the US, makes this clear in one of his treatises, The Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. In the preface of the defense, as we'll see, Adams discusses in detail the Greek democracy as not an appropriate model of reference for the newly born US republics. Citing Thucydides 382-83 and the famous Stasis narrative at Corcyra, Adams points out that Greece has been too frequently thorned by civil strife. To make his argument stronger, he cites Hume's use of Diodorus Siculus to reconstruct the human slaughter that civil discord has generated in the Greek past. And he goes on for like 3 pages about all the people that had been slaughtered in the civil strife of ancient Greece, just as like an ending. It's not a very good essay in this text, I must say. And concludes by asking his readers this question: is such a system as this to be recommended to Americans in this age of the world? The answer is, of course, no. A different perspective instead, as anticipated, is offered towards the Roman Republic. So my aim today is not to analyze in depth the overall use of what the fathers made of the Roman past. The generous 45-minute slot will not be enough, unfortunately, to develop a thorough and comprehensive discussion on this topic. Moreover, studies on republicanism and the influence of the classics for the founding fathers have risen in recent years. We have books starting, from the pivotal text of Petit in 97, 6, I don't remember exactly, until, Niederberger and Schrink in the bibliography, or Richard looking precisely to the way the classics influence the fathers. So that's not my point. I will instead concentrate on the way the Roman past has been analyzed, instrumentalized, and discussed by John Adams in the first volume of the Defense of the Constitutions. This text, alongside mentions to other fundamental references to Rome in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers in particular, will provide a general idea on the way the Roman Republic has been functional to the development of the American political discourse. The Roman precedent, I argue, in addition to be fundamental for the development of the doctrine of republicanism, is also essential to understand the limitations and dangers of the uncontrolled powers and the masses in particular when led by a powerful leader. As we will see, Adams's analysis of the relevance of the Roman past abruptly ends with the age of Tiberius Gracchus, after which Rome progressively collapsed into a monarchy. The inverted commas are a must here. I will argue, however, that the period that followed, represented in particular by the rise to power of Julius Caesar, is all but irrelevant to understand the importance of the Roman past in the American political discourse on democracy then, and most importantly, now. In order to demonstrate how relevant this discussion is today, in the final part of my paper, I will leave the origins of the United States marginally in the background and focus on the way the Roman past is used and instrumentalized nowadays in the American political discourse surrounding the figure of Donald Trump. I will conclude my paper, therefore, with an analysis of the two opening speeches at the second impeachment trial of the 52nd President of the United States. And I argue that the speeches, in addition to the political discourse surrounding the Trump presidency, provide fundamental evidence on how necessary it is for scholars and general public alike to discuss and analyze the Roman Republican past and its political instrumentalization in American politics beyond the ending point assigned by the founding fathers. So, before discussing the way poor Caesar is associated to Trump, let's see what made Rome the perfect precedent for John Adams. So Adams published his Defense of the Constitutions in 1787-88, while serving as a US ambassador in London, so before his presidency. The book is comprised of 3 volumes, and it's intended as a response to the French economist Anne Robert Jacques Turgot. I'm very bad in French, so apologies for my pronunciation of the name. Turgot, while supporting the American independence, rejected the idea that a bicameral legislature was the best form of democracy, arguing instead that a unicameral legislature and a weak executive power offered a more democratic solution. Thought primarily as a response to this criticism, Adams's book were also intended as a counteraction to the misunderstood interpretations and assessment of the European governments toward the republics of the United States. The book is in fact a written defense of the various state constitutions and the proposed general constitution, whose writing began in 1787, the year the book is published. Adams, in a letter dated 15th of January to Richard Crench, defines the first volume published on January the 1st, a strange book, quote unquote, and admits that it is so, quote, so hasty a production, unquote, on which he had started to work only from November. So basically worked on the first book for a couple of months. The hastiness in this publication and the almost contemporary publication of the Federalist Papers show the need that the founding fathers had to justify and support their constitutional choices, both to their detractors and the general public. But how is Adams employing the example of the Roman Republic in support of these choices? So in the preface, the aforementioned preface, where he says that Athens and Greece are not an example, he suggests that both England and America adopted the method of a wise architect in political deliberations and consult the authorities of the past in order to establish a new system of laws. Like the architect would consult the works of Vitruvius or Palladio to build the most majestic building, so they had looked at past and contemporary states, as well as the highest authorities on political thought, to build their constitutional models. It is at this point that Adams introduces references to the Roman political thinking of Tacitus and Cicero. So as noted by scholarship, Adams is keener in referencing to the Roman past and the Latin authors rather than to Greek text. Latin is always quoted verbatim with no translations, while Greek is offered only in a translation, also to address a widest audience who knew more the former than the latter. And there is a long diatribe between him and Hamilton about this in other letters. No, Hamilton, the other one, Jefferson, sorry. So the passage of Tacitus cited is part of the famous digression on the history of Rome and the role of the historian presented at Annals 4, 32, and 3. And this is handout 2, with in bold the part quoted by Adams. Adams' limited selection of Tacitus' text is instrumental, of course, and considering his obsession with the idea of balance that we will see coming up later and need to avoid complete popular control is also quite peculiar. He does not include Tacitus' following comment on the fact that in the early Republic, it was imperative to understand the character of the masses, especially in a time when some sort of power is effectively granted to the people. Adams recognizes Tacitus' doubts over the Republican institution, but does not elaborate on the reasons why he criticized them. Of course, for a historian of Roman history such as Tacitus, the Republic mostly meant a period, especially the late Republic later on, of lost libertas that ended with the enslavement of the Principate. And his acceptance of the Principate and the new libertas it had produced from the Civil War did not make him a good supporter of the new established republics, which were based on the Republican institutions of the past. So the brief decontextualized and instrumentalized reference to Tacitus, however, easily disappears from the eyes of the reader when compared to Adams's use and admiration of Cicero. So in the preface, immediately after quoting Tacitus and say, yes, Tacitus is doubtful about this government, even though it's the best government, it's the best constitution ever, and after ignoring, what Tacitus actually said about the control of the people. Among many quotations, Adams quotes the Republica 241, where Cicero argues via Scipio and echoing Polybius 6 that the best constitution for a state to be sorry, I need to be that. I consider the best constitution for a state to be that which is a balanced combination of the three forms mentioned, so kingship, aristocracy, and democracy, and does not irritate by punishment a rude and savage art. For being so supportive of the mixed constitution, Adams, which is also at the base of the United States constitutions, of course, Adams defines Cicero the greatest statesman and philosopher of all the ages of the world. So I'm sorry for the other philosophers. According to Adams, the best one and the greater one was Cicero. Polybius too is studied in detail by Adams in the treaty, who considered the mixed constitution, again, the best form of government. And of course, Polybius is arguing for the same as well for the mixed constitution. Phil, you mentioned this, this way in which the Americans kind of forced almost this idea of the mixed constitution and the way in which it was from the past that they based it. But what he does with Polybius is very superficial. So he does not discuss Polybius in detail. He paraphrased basically his words on the Roman Republican institutions to show how a single system of government is destined to fail. So we need a balanced, which Rome was not, as we'll see, a balanced mix between the three. This way of paraphrasing that Adams has, as we'll see also below, is a systemic flaw, I think, in his treaty. It doesn't really give us any big evidence of why this is essential for the defense of the Constitution. It just reports what the ancient says, or, later historians. So I think he would probably receive a very low 2-2 if it was an essay, but, no critical thinking is very, put forward in this analysis of Polybius, for example. I think this is probably due to the haste he had in publishing the work, as well as the possible idea that paraphrasing the ancient, and this is why also he quotes Cicero in like verbatim, was more so paraphrasing or quoting directly was more authorial than commenting them. So he prefers to say, okay, Polybius says so, this is what it was, let's move forward from that. The importance of Cicero, again, and the De Republica in studies on republicanism, as I said, is unmistakable. And I will not discuss this in detail here. It is, however, important to know that Cicero's conception of the ideal res publica, as presented at Republica 139, and this is the end of 5, where Scipio says the res publica est res populi, and this is the quotation that you mentioned yesterday, Phil, is often used as a foundational definition of what a liberal republic shall entail. And this, of course, in connection to what he says later, so that people is not any collection of human beings, Scipio says, but an assemblage of people in large numbers associated in agreement with respect to justice and a partnership for the common good. We may wonder what the common good was. It can be a very much adapted concept, but again, this is evident. It's evident here why Adams found this as essential for the kind of constitution that they were putting forward for the newly established federal republics. But again, the context in which the text of Cicero is written is not fully developed in Adams's analysis. Adams was aware that Cicero writes about a republic that is disappearing, but could not emphasize, of course, this aspect on his text. If he wanted the model to be useful for his purpose. So Cicero's treaty was composed in the late 50s, after the consulship of Caesar in 59, during which we have some evidence that he was often considered as acting alone, and in the years that led to the solo consulship of Pompey in 52, and then later on to the Civil War. Cicero, whose political career is facing more than one difficulty in this period, finding the writing of political philosophical treatises the means for voicing his views on the progressive centralization of power that will lead to the Principate, and a final appeal to the people to reinstate a republic, something that he will do again later on with Caesar in the Pro Marcello. Adams took from Cicero what was fundamental for his work, as we all do, and the fact so that an authority on political thought such as him, regardless of the imminent collapse, or sort of imminent collapse, if you want, it's very much it's a very kind of blurry idea, is providing theoretical evidence for the American model. Discussion, however, on the limits of the Roman Republic, because of course what he is aiming to do with this text is to show that yes, the Roman Republic was a good model, but it has its flaws that us as Americans, are going to fix in a new, better, balanced constitution, are not absent in the text. So they're just postponed in it. So the text is organized in the forms of letters. It discusses, as I said, contemporary, medieval, and ancient forms of democracies, with jumps around the text. In letter 37, so a few letters after the preface, after citing Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Adams recognizes that even though both Rome and Sparta were able to create a tripartite constitution, the balance was very imperfect, making them predominantly an aristocracy rather than a democracy or even a monarchy. He also highlights that both in the case of Romulus and of Lycurgus, the aristocracy controlled the monarchies, showing his mistrust of monarchies again. To sustain the point, he reports the version according to which Romulus did not become a god, but was instead killed by the senators for aiming, as they pretended, at more power than his share. This, Adams continues, enabled the patricians to carry their first point, for it is always the first point of the aristocracy to make the first magistrate elective. So the flaws in the Roman model are where the United States should work and surpass in order to establish a better, more stable and balanced divisions of the powers. After discussing Romulus, it jumps again at the end in letter 37, it will return to the Roman past at the end of book 1 in letter 52. in quite a long chapter where he summarizes the events that are usually identified as what we call the struggle of the orders, which are the various steps, of course, that led to the plebeian recognition in the Roman political order. So after a quick reminder of what he had discussed in earlier chapters, Adams outlines the story of Rome from, from the early Republic onwards, following the Scottish historian Adam Ferguson's History of the Progress and Determination of the Roman Republic, published a few years earlier in 1783. Again, it doesn't comment on Ferguson's, he instead summarizes and paraphrases what he does. And the choice of summarizing instead of discussing is, again, a clear sign of the hastiness he had to publish the book. However, despite the scholastic weakness of the chapter, what emerged from this letter is once more the stress that Adams gives to an idea of balance among the various powers. This balance is a key term in Adams's political thought, and to his view, it is of course the decay of this balance that caused Rome to fall into the sovereignty of the Caesars, which he usually refers as a catastrophe. If the balance would have been maintained, the Roman Republic would have never ceased to exist, hypothetically, but instead remain in vigor and in glory at this hour. So what he's trying to do is basically saying, you know, there was balance up to a certain point, especially after the plebeians had a certain amount of power and they could, you know, interact with the aristocracy and the Senate and the politicians. However, by the time, you know, we reached to the end of the first century, this all erupts into a catastrophe. So in letter 52, located strategically at the end of the book, we see again an overall admiration for this mid-republic. Adams, still following Ferguson, attributes the beginning of the end to the figure of Tiberius Gracchus, as anticipated in the introduction, as we often still do even nowadays when we start teaching. I mean, I started teaching last year the crisis of the Roman Republic. I started from the period, you know, of the conquest of Greece, and then Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus and so forth. It is at this moment of Roman history when the so admired figure of the tribune as representative of the plebs, and you know, the tribune is someone that Adams underlines very often in the treaty, you know, as the most important figure in the Republic, as the representative of the people, as the one that should, you know, work to support and to give power to the people. So it is when this figure, represented by Tiberius Gracchus, allegedly at least, tried to seize power, absolute power, that Adams ends abruptly his summary of Ferguson history and concludes, in haste as much as he wrote the text, the discussion with a categorical judgment of Marius, Sulla, and Caesar. And here I quote, Marius carried the popular pretensions still higher than the Gracchi, and Sulla might, if he would have been emperor. Caesar followed and completed the catastrophe. That is where he ends. His judgment on the reasons why the Republic failed as a democracy is reiterated. It was the lack of balance between the various offices. The conclusion of the letter, this is handout 8, points out once more to the positive examples of the Republic, second only to the English Constitution, but mostly its flaws. Perpetual domestic conflict and internal revolutions, and here we can argue, is not so dissimilar to what he said about Athens and Greece at the beginning in the preface, which result from the want of independence in each branch and from an unequal balance, in case you were wondering. In other words, the history of Rome is instrumental to defend the governmental choices in the US, but only up to a certain point. Afterwards, it becomes chaotic and inappropriate as a model like Athens was. After that point, no example shall be taken from Rome, and even discussing what comes next, the catastrophe, is sort of superfluous. Sorry. And yet, not everybody at the time believed it so. In the same period, a number of articles known as the Anti-Federalist Papers started to appear in the US and criticized the various elements of the Constitution to be. 8 articles in particular were published under the pseudonym of an old Whig. Among the authors behind the name, there was, for example, George Bryan, the president of Pennsylvania, who opposed the Federalist choice of the Constitution, especially due to its bicameral legislature and a single president in command. And this is a striking point in the discussion. The problem of the single executive power in the figure of the president was not limited to the articles of the Old Whig. In the Madison debates of June 4th, 1787, so we're always in the same year, that is the year in which the Constitution is supposed to take form, it was amply discussed the option of having 3 leaders with equal share of power instead of 1, who would resemble too much the figure of the king. In the same debate, Elbridge Gerry argues that having 3 leaders, however, would be extremely inconvenient, would be extremely inconvenient in many instances, particularly in military matters, whether relating to the militia, an army, or a navy. It would be a general with 3 heads, unquote. So the president of the triumvirate, in terms of Roman models, if we want, the unofficial of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus first, and then the official one of Octavian, Lepidus, and Antony is not mentioned in the debate, but I think it's quite likely that it was not ignored. The 5th article of the Old Whig is also particularly interesting in this matter, showing how the president of Rome and the civil wars that left Caesar as the one in command of the army was also a fundamental part of the discussion about the new government. So the Old Whig's paper, this is paper 5, and is handout 9 and 10, is in support of the introduction of a Bill of Rights to protect the liberty and the right of conscience of the American people. Among the reasons to introduce further protection towards the people, the Old Whig discusses the potential threat executed by the president. As you can see in the section that I reported here, the Anti-Federalist recognizes in the accumulation of the presidential powers a risk for the freedom of the people. What would happen if someone less virtuous than George Washington, the second Cincinnatus, who went back to his rural life at the end of the mandate, would seize the power and refuse to let it go? What if, quote, like Julius Caesar, unquote, who according to Adams had completed the catastrophe and destroyed the republic, this future president would be ambitious and poor as well as highly in debt? Little bit of like kind of a foretelling of the future. In the words of the Old Whig, quote, such a man would die 1,000 deaths rather than sink from the heights of splendor and power into obscurity and wretchedness, unquote. Benjamin Franklin himself, in the 4th of June debate mentioned before, the Madison debate, considered the dangers of those coming after Washington. And there is handout 11. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. The executive will be always increasing here as elsewhere till it ends in a monarchy. Julius Caesar, rather than being set aside, becomes therefore a sort of method of comparison to whom the newly founded US should prepare. And it is important to consider this precedent, despite its clear instrumentalization and simplification, as much as Cicero's theoretical views when we discuss the way in which the United States Constitution is born. So it is clear, therefore, that despite the procedures taken to contain the power of the president, not all the founding fathers and other theorists of the constitutions and the debates in those years considered the history of Rome to stop being a model of reference after the end of the Republic. The danger of the one-man rule represented by the president continued to be a central part of the constitutional deliberation in the early years of the American democracy. This aspect of the founders' discussion and their lack of foreseeing all the potential dangers of the one-man executive is more and more topical nowadays. After Joe Biden had won the elections against Donald Trump in November 2020, journalist Gillian Brockel published an article on the Washington Post with the title, "The Founders Didn't Prepare for a President Who Refuses to Step Down," historians say. Quoting the very same article of the Old Whig and addressing the fact that in the Constitution there is no reference to this potential threat to the democracy. So despite the fact that they discussed about this, there was nothing in the Constitution that says what to do if someone refused to give up power. So the evidence of Rome's importance in discussing these dangers for democracy become, I think, relevant once more when we discuss the aftermath of January the 6th, 2021, and the riots of Trump supporters against the Capitol. So in conclusion of this long and admittedly not exhaustive discussion on how the American political discourse applied the Roman precedent to its constitutional discussion on democracy and the best form of government, I would like to draw your attention on the events that occurred at the end of Donald Trump's presidency. Promise there is a link to all of this. So just to recap very briefly, on the 6th of January 21, following the defeat of Trump in the 59th presidential election, an uncontrolled group of his supporters, also known as MAGA, assaulted the Capitol building in Washington. As I'm sure all of us remember, the reason for the attack prompted by the exiting president was to overturn the election that has seen him defeated. This is something that has been since the November 2020. In other words, Trump refused to concede the election and steered his supporters against the governmental building. For this reason, the government of the United States afterwards passed a resolution for a second charge of impeachment against the former president. And a part of this is reported at Handout 12, where there are the reasons for the trial. So on the 9th of February, Trump was taken to trial for a second time, this time with the accusation of incitement of insurrection, becoming the first US president to face such an accusation. We know he would be acquitted only 5 days later. And if we look at the text of the article of impeachment, it says that he threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled the coordinated branch of government. President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government. So the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump generated a lot of media and social attention. What caught my attention, in particular, is the use, or better misuse, of the Roman past made in the opening speech of Trump's lawyer, Bruce Castor, and this is in Handout 13. So if we look at Handout 13, and I will read it in its entirety, because it's very important, I think, we shall see immediately in the opening that Castor's strategy is to refer to the Founding Fathers and the Federalist Papers. So, quote, "In our system of government, and if you read the Federalist Papers, we were very fortunate because the Federalist Papers were authored as an explanation for why it is the states, the original state, should adopt the Constitution." Not my English, this is just a transcript. "These were persuasive documents about why the Constitution is a good thing, because if the individual state legislatures didn't adopt the Constitution, we would not have it. So Mr. Jay, Mr. Madison, Mr. Hamilton, they had an incentive to explain what they were thinking when they wrote it, because they are explaining to other erudite people who represent individual states why it is that they feel that this is the right thing to do." It's extremely convoluted, so don't worry if it's a little confused. So in this convoluted English, to support Trump and argue for the unconstitutional nature of the charge, which was Castor's legal strategy, this lawyer, to remember the legal strategy that he uses is to remember the audience of the existence of the Federalist Papers and the importance of the written Constitution. He repeats Constitution so many times that, it's clear that he wants the people to think that what they're doing to Trump is unconstitutional. So far, nothing completely unexpected. However, it is not just the author of the Federalist Papers who are recalled in Castor's speech. After repeating again the importance and value of the Constitution, he decided to call into question the exemplar of Athens and Rome. And again, this passage is quite important to read it in full. Sorry for these long quotations. So the last time a body such as the United States Senate sat at the pinnacle of government with the responsibility that it has today, it was happening in Athens. So it's ignoring completely the democracies we discussed today after Athens. And it was happening in Rome. Republicanism, the form of government, republicanism throughout history, has always and without exception fallen because of fights from within. Repeating again this idea that they are fallen because of civil strife. Because of partisanship from within, because of bickering from within, and each one of those examples that I mentioned, so two, and there are certainly others probably that are smaller countries that lasted for less time that I don't know about off the top of my head, but each one of them, once there was the vacuum created that the greatest deliberative bodies, the Senate of Greece, sitting in Athens, and the Senate of Rome, the moment that they devolved into such partisanship, it's not as though they ceased to exist. They ceased to exist as representative democracy, both replaced by totalitarianism. So in this speech, Castor points out the precedents of Rome and Athens as democracies which fell for internal strife and attacks to the right of freedom of speech, an element, as we know, particularly dear to Trump's rhetoric and his populism. In the this is just in the first 2 minutes of the defense of Trump's insurrectional trial. Therefore, Castor believed it was fundamental to mention not only the Federalist Papers, but also the allegedly precedent of Greece and Rome as representative democracies that turned into totalitarian regimes once internal strife erupted and freedom of speech was put under control. Terminology here, as you can see, is completely misused. Not only he uses clearly for a better understanding by the People's Senate for the Greek institutions, but Castor's use of totalitarian in discussing Greek and Roman precedents, I believe, is completely out of place, associating the Macedonian and Roman Empire to the totalitarian Macedonian and the Diadochi Roman Empire to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. What is also important to consider is that in the whole speech, this is the only time that the word democracy appears. There's no reference to it in the rest of the speech, and is not used to describe the United States of America, but to describe Rome and Athens. So Castor uses representative democracy to exemplify two forms of government that could not be more different from one another. Well, they're sort of more or less, but also that he and his team thought would help to support the cause of Donald Trump. In other words, like Greece and Rome fell into totalitarian dictatorship before, the United States are facing the same risk by allowing a president to be incriminated for insurrection that he started. And after he prompted them all to assault the symbols of American balanced democracy. I'm sure the paradox of the argument does not need to be highlighted. I'm not sure even Castor would pass an essay with such an essay. So if we look at, so this is for Castor. If we look at a short abstract from the speech of the opponent side, represented by Jamie Raskin, we see a different emphasis on the role of the Constitution and the models of the past. Under the Constitution, Mr. Raskin said, quote, the President of the United States is bound to commit high crimes and misdemeanors against the people at any point that he's an office, and continues by quoting Federalist Paper 1, saying that Hamilton in Federalist 1 said, quote, into the quote, the greatest danger to republics and the liberties of the people comes from political opportunists who began as demagogues and end as tyrants, and the people who are encouraged to follow them. Despite his name not being made, it seems quite possible to me that there is a hidden reference to Caesar in Hamilton's words, showing again the relevance and importance of people like Caesar, or before Caesar, Publius Claudius, in the discourse about populism and the problems that a certain type of leader could create in political discourse. I think these references to Caesar are not completely random references, and the way in which they are connected to Donald Trump actually show how these relations, these connections, this attempt made by Castor to show the the way in which the trial against Trump was attacking democracy instead of defending it, are destined to rebound basically. And I just have a couple of examples here, which doesn't work. Okay, so this is just the thing. So basically, one of the main associations to Trump was, of course, is Emperor Nero. We see here that most articles, memes, and blog, but also there's an entire book called The American Nero, the history of the destruction of the rule of law and why Trump is the worst offender, is the most common view that we have of Trump. Trump is a new Nero. The fiddling meme is particularly interesting because, he retweeted it after it was tweeted for the first time by his own social media manager, Dan Scavino. Again, it's a meme against Trump that compares him to Emperor Nero and the way in which he didn't care, apparently, to the people of the empire as much as Trump didn't care when the pandemic started towards to the people of the US. He didn't understand it, The quote, of course, nothing can stop what's coming, is related to QAnon. So again, there is an attack on Trump here. He doesn't understand it. His social media manager doesn't understand it. They retweet it, and then this starts like a long list of retweeting about people attacking Trump, and then Trump people attacking the anti-Trump people, and never-ending story. Sort of Nero baby Trump there is again one of the things that is often found on social media and popular culture about the president. So referencing to the end of Rome as the end of freedom with all this going on is already one thing. But what happens again is there is a lot of discourse in political editorials, in political memes and stuff in around the journals, magazines, social media again, that compares Donald Trump to Julius Caesar. So there is a lot of misinterpretation of Caesar. I mean, I don't think poor Caesar deserves that, but still there is a lot of attempt to show that what Trump was doing to democracy is basically what Julius Caesar allegedly was doing to democracy, so leading it towards a tyranny and a monarchy, and the idea that the people were not going to be free anymore. And this is just an illustration of an article on Politico, but what is very interesting is that in 2017, so 4 years before this trial, after Trump came to power, the Public Theater of New York put on scene the Julius Caesar and used and the characters were basically the Trump family and the Trump administration. So Julius Caesar was Donald Trump, and as you can see here, after the Ides of March, Calpurnia was very close to Melania Trump. So there is a lot in the uglier, a lot of a lot of attempt to show the parallels between the tyrannical aspect of Caesar's memory and what Donald Trump was going to be for the United States. So the reference, I think, to Athens and Rome that Castor was making, I think are destined to suffer a rebound effect at the eyes of the public opinion, especially in the age where we see this kind of comparisons, where we see this kind of memes, and Trump based a lot of his supporters as consensus. His propaganda is what we call computational propaganda, is based on social media. So everything that needs to be given to the public for support or Trump was done mostly through the social media rather than the usual normal media. So it's destined to rebound. It's not destined to like kind of let us say, oh yes, the Federalists were saying this. This is unconstitutional. This is what happened in Rome and Greece. This, I think, it was not used very well. So before I lose myself as well, just to conclude, both parties included references to the founding fathers. As we would expect, there is a return to the idea of constitution that needs to be proved and to make a point. And consequently, they made allusions to the Roman constitution and its development into an imperial centralized form of government that, at their eyes, had destroyed the republic. What Adams refused to discuss, and what the Old Whig pointed out, was that the US, as Rome, were at risk of a tyrannical new Caesar that could have become, dangerous for the new balanced order. And this, and I think the way in which Trump, in some ways, embodied this threat made the Roman precedent more and more relevant to us, and highlighted the need to move forward the discussion of the fathers and stop there in order to prevent democracies to die and Franklin's prophecy to become true, so that the democracy will centralize power so much at the end to become a monarchy. So just to conclude, my paper today discussed more or less the way political discourse in the United States used, interpreted, and misused the Roman past as a way to make constitutional choices more approachable and at the same time more dignified by proving a prestigious precedent. We have seen how, prompted by the need to support the choice of a tripartite balanced constitution, Adams referred to ancient works, either verbatim or via paraphrases, but refused to discuss the dangers that led to the establishment of the Principate. These dangers were not completely ignored by the founders and those who questioned the choice of a presidential republic with so much power in the figure of the president, even if, as we know, it's balanced, but the dangers were still there. So the figure of Caesar, more than Augustus, offered relevant examples of the dangers that a one-man rule and a willing crowd to follow could entail. The events of January the 6th seems to demonstrate the validity of the old Whigs' doubts. I'm not a constitutional historian nor a theorist of the American Constitution. Part of my research, however, is centered on the relevance of the Roman past to understand and evaluate modern and contemporary political scenarios. And so I hope I showed you how relevant it is to continue to think about the way in which not just the political theory of the Republic, but also the very turbulent years that led to the Principate are essential to understand the dangers and the development and the dangers that democracy face even today. So just a final remark, the Washington Post reporter and editor, Bob Woodward, that is famous for revealing the Watergate scandal, as you know, probably to the world, repeatedly says that democracy dies in darkness, with reference to governmental secrecy. The Washington Post, after Trump's election and following his open attack on the media, that you probably also remember, has acquired the sentence as a logo. This was, received with more or less, approval. I don't think I'm sure democracy dies in darkness, to be honest. I'm more afraid that democracy may die in open clarity unless we find a way to switch on a light and understand the threats it faces before it's too late. Analyzing the Roman past, even though it maybe is not essential, but the use and misuse that was made by the politicians, I hope can help us to do so and to avoid a new Trump coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
All right, well, I have plenty to say, of course, but I do not want to abuse my role as chair, so I will hold myself off for as long as possible and turn it over to anyone else. Got like 10 seconds left or I'll leap in.
Sorry.
Sorry, can see you back. Yeah, please.
It's supposed to say 10 seconds.
Yeah, you just made it.
Thank you so much, Mr. I just wanted to ask you something about context.
Yeah.
So Adams, I mean, you repeatedly underlined that he was writing, he was in haste, he wanted to publish. Why? What's happening there? Why is so important for him? What is the wider context? What do you think he was trying to achieve by publishing his work?
So, as I said, it does that to make like a response to Turgot, because Turgot has written a text in which it says, no, this is not the right form of government they should have. They should have a bicameral thing, with less power on the execution. So the main thing he says, I'm writing this as a response. So it's kind of, debate between the two. But what was happening is also that in Europe, they were not really understanding, or they were kind of criticizing as well what was happening in the United States. Because they didn't know exactly what was going on. So even people like Turgot, who supported the independence, were not completely aware of what they were doing. So he wanted to share with them, what prompted them to certain choices in the constitutional form they chose. And to do that, he kind of made this long list of ancient democracies and what they did wrong and what we're doing right. It's kind of reiterating all the time, this was not right to do, we should do this and that. So it's a real defense. It's very haste, I think, because it's the year in which they are starting to write down the Constitution. So, and they have receiving attacks in the US as well by the anti-federalists that said, listen, you have to consider this and that as well. So they're all trying to get support from the people as well. So that's why they make it as accessible as possible, as well as the other powers in the world, if it makes sense.
Yeah, but therefore, do you think his main target, so his main readership, were more on the European side or the American side?
I think a little bit of both, to be honest. Probably, since I think is looking at the European side more than, because we have the Federalist Papers in the US addressing the people there. So it's kind of in support of that, I think, it's kind of making a point and because it was in London also at that time, and he knew and he heard what the people said about what they were doing in the US. So it was like, yeah, maybe I kind of fix the situation and I say what we are really doing, this probably something like that.
On this point, I do know that there was, not just in London, but also in France, there was definitely a PR effort
exactly.
to send out intellectuals to chat
Yeah.
with, folks in these areas after the revolution.
Yeah.
Yes, you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Consuelo. What do you read in the fact that Adams calls the comitia legislatures? And does he?
It's Hamilton. This one. I think.
Hamilton.
Yeah.
And does he at any point reflect on the fact that actually those two comitia don't just work in fundamentally different ways, but do fundamentally different things?
Yeah.
Really, the comitia temporata don't do much legislation at all.
No. Yeah, I still have to think very much in detail about that. I mean, Adams talks about the comitia, of course, but when I read again, I don't think it's in there anywhere because I removed all the quotations later on when he's just paraphrasing Ferguson. Yeah, because he's such in a haste that he doesn't even stop thinking, not thinking, but just, discussing in detail. So he just reports the history of Rome to make the people aware of what's the precedent he's using. Yeah, I think, as I said, I think they're taking what they think is relevant for them, and they're adapting to the context in which they need without getting too much into detail about what it actually was. As you said, the Comitia Centuriata were not, voting, were not legislative powers so much as, others in Rome. And I think they're also trying to simplify the discourse, especially when they're addressing people and stuff like this. But yeah, it's a very complex. When I was working to this paper, I felt like I opened like a Pandora box because it was it's a very complex discourse and with a lot of shades, I think, in the way in which they use the Roman past and instrumentalize it as on their own terms, if it makes sense.
Yeah.
On that point, I will abuse my privilege a little bit. And I think that there's an important intermediate step. I think, they're definitely thinking of these sources. I mean, the quotations prove that, and they're thinking explicitly, but there's also work by European scholars like Montesquieu and whatnot, who are reflecting on the tradition and are getting read by the founding fathers. And so there's a sort of like reflexive sort of loop back to the sources, to the interpreters, back to the sources. And that would be an interesting angle to add in. I have a little bit of a worry on one point, which is that you are citing Cicero's Republic at several points. And I think this isn't going to work. I don't think it's a fatal issue because you can find passages in, for example, De Legibus or De Officiis. But if I recall correctly, Angelo Mai discovered the fragments of De Republicana at palimpsest in 1820 or something like that, which would post date the 1794 stuff. Now, you could check these individual passages whether they are ones that are preserved by St. Augustine or Lactantius.
Yeah, it uses Augustine. Yeah, it's in Augustine. Yeah.
Okay.
The passage he has are in Augustine. That I had a part of Augustine also, because Augustine is the one that says, Cicero is talking about something that he knows is going to grounds. But he's using that. Okay, good. So it's not a major concern, but I mean, that does open the question of, we sort of have to bracket all of the stuff in the Republic. And when you're reading scholarship on Cicero's political philosophy, you sort of have to subtract all of the evidence from that, and what would it look like
given the information they'd had.
Yeah.
So, for example, the issue of the mixed constitution, a lot of like scholars like Atkins and so forth are stressing that in contrast to Polybius, which is a sort of model of, you know, the different branches fighting against each other in opposition, a little bit like Hamilton in book 1, and this relates to his Anthropology of Human Weakness in book 6 of the Histories. Atkins stresses that Cicero adopts a model of harmony, right? The Concordia of Ordinate,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, is that there if you take out the Republic? And I don't know, but that would be an interesting thing
Yeah.
to look
I
at.
was thinking this morning of the Concordia, because I was thinking, you know, this kind of thing, what is Cicero actually arguing and everything, and you know how they can, you know, use Cicero in this way while, you know, kind of taking out and that's what, you know, struck me, you know, about the context, you know, about the context of Ciceronian philosophy, but also the context of the historical moments in which he's developing this philosophy, because it's a moment of turmoil, it's a moment that is unstable, it's a moment in which, you know, it looks back to this idea of stability while trying to understand, you know, what kind of, I don't know, constitution is the right way, what kind of form would work again. I mean, he does it the same in the Pro Marcello. It says like, okay, Caesar, you're now back, you're the victor, please give back the republic, Caesar, come on, give back the republic. He repeats it all the time, and that remind me, I think this text should be read more in connection with each other, because it's trying to prove like a model in both the text, but one is like a philosophical treaty, which, you know, is kind of more theoretical. The other one is a speech that he does in defense of Marcellus to get, you know, to arrive to Caesar, and tries to show that, you know, okay, he tries to do what you will try to do later with Octavian, right, to become this advisor of the one in charge, of the person that is in charge, and it doesn't work with Caesar very much, because yeah, he was not really fond of Cicero, but yeah, it opened a lot of questions, and I think there's no real conclusions that we can reach today, probably, because it's such a big topic. I don't know.
Conclusions about the nature of democracy, or the sort of what sources
No,
they're
no,
engaging?
my
Yeah, yeah.
thing. Don't worry.
It's bad for Phil's project. Okay.
No,
Yeah,
no,
Phil.
sorry.
Just a question about the old Whig.
Yeah,
It's a great name. I love this because we are old oligarch.
Yeah.
So now we've got the old Whig too.
Student favorite in NAPTA.
He's an absolute favorite in NAPTA because the text is fun. If APTA's ancient political thought and action capacity. So old Whig sounds like Plato to me.
Ooh.
So when I read old Whig, he's making arguments which are not quoting Plato, but they're kinds of things you find in the Republic about what happens with tyrants. Yeah. So the problem that faces Plato is that ideally a monarchy is the best form of government, but you can't have, and Aristotle thinks so too. But you can't have a monarch, or at least you have to. If you entrust so much power into the hands of one person, that person can inevitably either themselves become corrupt, or within a generation or two, their family line will be corrupt. So then that's
which is
the
also
laws.
what Franklin says, right? You know, the first one who gets the power is going to be, of course, a perfect choice, and
What
then
about the
what
next
happens
one?
next?
That's the real big problem. So I wonder if it might be worth tracking the other side of it with the anti-federalist papers.
Yeah.
Whether that's actually there are Platonic criticisms of the democracy, or of the kinds of demagogic democracies that Plato is particularly worried about.
Yeah, I think I didn't have time to look into all the anti-federalist papers, but actually something I really want to do, because I think, you know, as you rightly says, you know, there's this kind of dualism, and I didn't think of Plato because it's not really my area, but it's really worth. I think it's really worth looking into it to understand the Federalist better, you know, and kind of make this and what happened in those years, you know, kind of make this more, to quote Adams, balanced view of what was happening, what they were doing in terms of, you know, understanding, writing a new form of democracy, you know, that was, according to them, better than the previous ones, right? Because that's basically the entire discourse is they had this inflow. We are fixing it until we didn't. And then we have January 6th with Trump refusing and just saying, you know, just where I put it, the thing is that, you know, to his supporters, kind of, you know, we've been robbed by this election, you know, just, you know, remember that and so forth. You know, I'm not repeating Trump stuff, of course, but yeah, it's a good point. Thank you.
So two follow-ups on that. First
Yeah.
one is that in passage 10, there's this great section where he says, or this is line 2, or to make the thing familiar, let us suppose a future president, commander-in-chief, adored by his army and the militia to as great a degree as our late illustrious commander-in-chief,
Yeah.
that's Washington. And we have only to suppose one thing more, that this man is without the virtue, the moderation, and love of liberty, which possess the mind of our late general. So I mean, this is exactly the kind of stuff you find in laws,
Mhm.
where there's description of why Cyrus was a great ruler and why Xerxes was such a putz, you know, and this is exactly the kind of thing that you get. So it's worth, I would say it's really worth examining these passages in relation to
Yeah.
Plato's Republican laws in particular.
Okay.
And then just the second thing is a follow-up. The one difference between Trump and Caesar is that Trump is not a military man.
Yeah.
This is a big difference for thinking about these issues, right? He's not
Yeah.
a dictator who came in, had the support of the military. You know,
He created an army in the people that, you know, of his
Yes,
rallies,
well,
but
he
it's not
created
an
he
army, of
created
course, in the terms of
yeah,
militia.
he created a mercenary army.
Yeah.
Which is what those people are, or created. I mean, he allowed the creation of
Yeah.
mercenary armies around him, so in the United States, and well, they were already being created anyway, but they were coalescing under him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, I think, an important big difference between Caesar and Trump, and you know,
Yeah.
also you mentioned some other differences, but I think it's worth just keeping that in mind, because everybody in these papers is worried about the person of military might behind him coming in and overthrowing everything. Trump didn't have that. He had the people behind him, which is the scary part. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting way it's interesting the way in which they kind of, you know, associate Trump to Caesar, you know, because what they tend to do, I think, is depicting Caesar as this obviously populist leader,
Right, sure.
you know,
Which he
fomenting,
was, yeah,
which
yeah.
somehow it was fomenting the masses. You know, there is this article on Politico that points out the legislation of 59 as a precedent to show the parallels between him and Trump with the Agrarian law. They never talk about the military, of course, because they can't force the parallel, I think, as you said, if they put forward the fact that Caesar was a military man, even though, you know, there's which was a great point in Rome and in the Augustan age, when we have, you know, Nicolaus talking about Caesar's death and saying they're giving all these honors to Caesar. The honors are a ruse, you know, in order to then, you know, kill him or anything, but he wasn't understanding them because he was a military man with no knowledge of politics, which is the complete opposite, you know, again, way of seeing Caesar in another different way, which is like, I think he uses what is it? Aperos technes politicus, something like this. So it's, I lost it. Poor Caesar has gone through, you know, all kinds of instrumentalization of his role and his memory and the way in which he's associated to politicians. So, you know, we start from the empire, and then we go through Napoleon and then onwards, and now he's compared to Trump all the time, even when it's not really the case, as you pointed out. So, yeah, but I will look into Plato's, of course. It's great.
So this is to follow up that discussion a little bit. So it seems to me that in the old work, by focusing so clearly on the commander-in-chief and the military leader part, speaks more to the comparison than at least we find in the Republic, where it's not a it's not a military.
It talks about Caesar, yeah, the Whig, yeah, like a Caesar.
So I was actually also thinking about Plato more in the Hamilton quote, the last text, with political opportunists who begin as demagogues and end as tyrants, and the people are encouraged to follow. So that sounds exactly like the Republic, the fate of the Republic.
So Jamie Raskin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
no, he's citing,
He's
citing
reciting
Hamilton.
Hamilton.
Yeah, oh, it's, yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if Hamilton even read Plato or if they were just doing the Roman stuff.
Probably
think
would have. They're,
he did.
they had a pretty hardcore classical education in the Northeast. of
Because in
the
that
United
case,
States.
this sounds like just taken directly out of.
Okay, I have to read more Plato.
Right, we'll go over younger to James and then we'll go back to.
Phil's displeasure with the military Caesarian commentary made me think idly that the better comparison there would in some ways be Augustus, who was not a military man but did raise militias around him. Then I wanted to know again, this is ignorance, why, well, from these examples, they all go to Caesar, right, as the example of the figure who ends the Republic rather than Augustus.
I know.
Is that because they're going to Cicero, but then they are going to Tacitus? I'm just, does Augustus feature in the founding fathers' justifications of?
Not that I found out. Augustus is even, when you so even in modern politics, the only one self-comparing himself to Augustus is Boris Johnson. As much as I know.
And Cincinnatus, don't forget.
They were very fond of, Republican figures, Cincinnatus for Washington and stuff. I think Caesar is seen as the one, because of the perpetual dictatorship, probably. I think that's, they look at the dictators as, the kind of model for the president because of the, the limitedness of the magistracy and yeah, I don't know why Augustus. I think it's also a matter of the fact that I think maybe by that time Caesar was already in Suetonius is the first one in the biographies of the Caesars, and it's not really a Caesar. I mean, for me, he's not a Caesar. For me, he's not the first emperor. Every time I read that he was the first emperor in essays or stuff, I just die a little bit because for me, he was not. It was the starting point, but we don't even know whether he wanted to become a king. There are theories that the dictatorship was only because of the Oriental expedition and the fact that he needed, the continuation of the power and imperium. And I think it's more about a matter of memory and how Caesar is believed to have been the one that started to destroy this institution, and then Augustus just completed the work, if it makes sense. But it's something I still am figuring out, and I don't know if I will ever figure out. To be honest, it's
as you say, it depends a bit who they're reading, right? Because I mean, as you say, that there is this clear difference between Tacitus, Suetonius, Cicero, etc., as to where they see that transition is happening. So if they're getting Cicero through Augustus and Lactantius, that's different than if they're getting Tacitus.
Yeah, and Tacitus, for example, he talks about Caesar among the emperors, but he calls him Dictator Caesar. He doesn't call him Divine Julius like other people does.
Yeah.
I think Ovid does.
Yeah.
Ovid's not even a pro, divine whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
but he still calls him Divine Julius.
But it's the way that the text of Suetonius is transmitted is Divus Julius, even though it doesn't call him like that very much, as far as I remember. But
I mean, but you can't expect a Christian, right? In this period probably.
True
to be like,
point.
oh, this guy's divine.
yeah, but with Tacitus, it doesn't seem to be like he's not the first emperor. I think the first emperor is Augustus, and then
Oh, Tiberius.
I agree, but it's not the point of a thing to open here.
So do we want to go? Let's go in the back.
I think that, so you're citing the fact that Caesar wasn't the first emperor, but he's the one who demolished the oligarchy. he fought for the freedom of the people of Rome in the common mind of the people, the poor people. He fought the Civil War start when Mark Antony didn't have the right to veto the Senate. So I think that is precisely this that the comparison of Trump is correct, because in Trump's rhetoric he is fighting for the freedom of Americans against small oligarchy of politicians and rich man.
I agree with that, but that could be any demagogue in antiquity.
Also,
So,
you know, Caesar was kind of instrumentalizing that stuff with Antony and everything. You know, there are evidence that he later on attacks tribunes. So of course, you know, you have this dualistic image that is, again, you know, can be rivalry or opposition propaganda, but Marulus and I forgot the name of the other one, you know, when he said, when he stopped the tribunes because they don't want to honor him or anything. I think in the case of with Mark Antony and the start of the Civil War, again, we are in a context which is completely unstable. He's looking to gain more power. He's attacking also because he's not getting what he wants. So and Antony, of course, was playing the game, right? And it's
yes, but we know this. The average Americans, no.
No, they don't know it. But, but there's an important point here, which is that this is the reason why I was emphasizing the military man. Because in America, it matters if you're a military man. It matters big time, way more than it does here. I mean, you know, Dwight Eisenhower was one of the is seen as one of the best presidents in the United States, not because he was a great president, but because he was a great general.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't underestimate that when you go to a Michigan football game and the jets fly over you. Yeah, as the American military is doing the band and everything. We have nothing like that in Europe, like anywhere, except maybe Hungary or whatever.
Well,
So,
the military parades in France and Italy, like we were.
Yes, but there's maybe France, but I mean,
Not the football.
not during every
Yeah,
football game. You
game,
know,
so
like I
that's-
mean, it's amazing.
Maybe it's
So,
culturally more powerful, but.
that's the only reason I mentioned it, is because we might in Europe underestimate
Yeah.
that, but in America, like it matters if you go to war. You know, like it's a big deal.
But we can also go back to the idea of Augustus not being a military man. So it's like a less relevant danger maybe in that context than it is Caesar.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if in the building of the image of Caesar, Plutarch is more important than Suetonius. Also for 18th and 19th century readers.
Yeah, I
And
don't
there
think
you
people
have
that's
a
Suetonius.
person who stands at the beginning of the empire, and the empire which is exploding outside.
Yeah, but Caesar is not.
It's imploding, yeah.
In
comparison.
America, you mean? Okay, I was thinking about Plutarch and Caesar, because Caesar is in the parallel lives, not in the imperial lives. So again,
No,
he's
no.
not the emperor.
No.
Okay.
but no, in the sense of this opposition, that they should not be compared, because Trump
yeah.
is doing exactly
The opposite.
the opposite. Yeah, he's closing America, whereas Caesar is opening.
Are there, I mean, I'm sure we could go on forever with a topic that stretches across so many authors and thinkers, but is there any other burning questions? Perhaps we should thank our speaker.
Thank you.
So I found this passage here just from a quick Google, right, where he's like, this is Hamilton talking about outline of his speech, right, his
Okay.
notes, and he's like Aristotle, Cicero, Montesquieu, Necker,
Yeah.
who I think is some.
I knew I had to go
Physiocrat.
look into Montesquieu, but it was just too much.
Yeah, so I think you have a choice here, because I've fallen down a pit with this, you know, Neil